Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live broadcast, When Good Biomarkers Go Bad, effectively utilizing Procalcitonin PCT for sepsis management to demonstrate the value of the lab. I'm Christina Jewell of LabRoots, and I'll be your moderator for today's event. We are delighted to bring you this Lab Leaders webinar series educational event presented by LabRoots and sponsored by Roche Diagnostics Lab Leaders. We have a few important announcements before we begin. This webcast is designed to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions during the event. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. We will try to answer as many questions as we can. You can enlarge the slide window by clicking on the screen icon in the lower right-hand corner of the slide window. Now, if you have any technical problems viewing or hearing this presentation, please click on the support button at the top right of your presentation window, or just submit your problem through the green Q&A button on the lower left. This is an educational webinar and thus offers free continuing education credits. When the webinar is over, please click on the CE button located at the bottom left-hand corner of your webpage and follow the process of obtaining your credits. Now, with no further ado, let's get started. As a global leader in healthcare, Roche Diagnostics has made the promise to empower laboratories and the people within them by providing clinical and strategic insights, support, and solutions from the industry's top innovators through lableaders.com. Today's presentation, When Good Biomarkers Go Bad, effectively using PCT and sepsis management to demonstrate the value of the lab, focuses on the opportunity high medical value biomarkers like PCT present for lab leaders to lead in the efforts to recognize and manage sepsis, the #1 cause in death in hospitals. Our presenter, Dr. Josh Hayden, is an assistant professor of pathology and laboratory medicine at the Weill Cornell Medical College, where he serves as the director of the Toxicology and Therapeutic Drug Monitoring Laboratory and assistant director of the Central Laboratory at New York Presbyterian Hospital. He received his PhD from Carnegie Mellon University, conducted postdoctoral research at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and completed a clinical chemistry fellowship at the University of Washington in Seattle. His research is focused on improving patient care through the development and implementation of advanced diagnostics. I will now turn it over to Dr. Hayden for his presentation. Dr. Hayden?
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you for joining us here for a talk on procalcitonin. Just to start, a little disclaimer. I think this is Roche's way of mentioning that some of the things I say will be my opinion, and so if they're incorrect or stupid, that's not their fault. So just blame that on me. Also, was paid an honorarium by Roche to give this presentation. So when we think about biomarkers, I wanted to start with a situation that some of us might be familiar with, right? Let's think about troponin as a biomarker and whether it's useful in the scenario depicted here. We have a patient come into our emergency department, let's say 9-10 p.m. on a Saturday. The clinician orders troponin, maybe within 20 minutes, the sample's run, processed by the lab, within 20 minutes again, and then it's placed in a rack to be run in a batch with a number of other troponins received throughout that busy Friday night on Saturday morning, at which point about 11 hours later, it's resulted as being high. So I think the question is, was troponin a useful biomarker in this situation? Which I guess begs the question, what is a useful biomarker? I took this from a 2016 Advances in Precision Medicine, and I think it lays out rather nicely what it takes to be considered a useful biomarker. The first is going to be the biologic validity. So does the analyte make biologic sense for the pathology being considered? In that area, I don't think there's any argument that cardiac troponin is a biologically valid biomarker. It's a good indicator of cardiomyocyte damage. The second is analytic validation. So can the analyte we're interested in be reliably detected at relevant concentrations in the samples we're hoping to analyze it in? Third is the clinical validation. So this would be the sensitivity, specificity, if you want to think about it that way. Does the analyte actually turn out to provide some value when you're looking at the intended patient population? And in terms of value, that really lies in the fourth one, which is the clinical utility. So does the analyte provide information that improves patient outcome or reduces the cost of care? And I think that last one, reducing the cost of care, is especially important as we move into the sort of affordable care era. We always need to be asking ourselves what we're doing that doesn't contribute to high-value care and what we should be doing to contribute to high-value care. So if you're wondering if you're in the right webinar, you are. We are going to be talking about procalcitonin, not dwelling on MI. And one of the reasons for that is rates of hospital admissions for sepsis far exceed those of myocardial infarction and stroke combined. If we're looking on the left at the adjusted rates for EMS admissions for 100 encounters, you can see that sepsis is more than double those of stroke and MI. So perhaps not surprisingly, given the high incidence, it also has a high mortality. It's the leading cause of death in the United States, with estimated at over 700,000 deaths annually due to sepsis. With the high mortality and high incidence, it's perhaps not surprising that there's also a very high cost of care. In fact, it's actually the major cause of healthcare expenditure. And organizations are starting to think actively about what they can do to manage sepsis. So just a quick polling question for you. Do you sit on your organization's sepsis committee? Answer yes, no, or our hospital does not have a sepsis committee. That third option would also count if you're not sure if a sepsis committee exists. So looking at the cost of sepsis, you can see that the average is about $22,000 per patient, over $20 billion annually. Certainly with numbers like this, CMS is really beginning to evaluate how it can start to improve both the cost of care and the quality. And we'll talk about some of the things that labs can bring to the table as we look to improve our medical centers' ability to contribute to this. So that's interesting. It looks like the majority of you actually don't sit on the sepsis committee in your hospital. And only a small percentage don't have or are unsure. So this brings us to our learning objectives for today's talk. So by the end of this webinar, the hope is that you'll be able to summarize the requirements and the implications of the new CMS Core Measures. Finally, to explain the role that procalcitonin can play in identifying bacteria as a source of sepsis. Start to think about the clinical performance required for procalcitonin to really be a useful biomarker for sepsis. And finally, understand how lab leaders should position procalcitonin with key stakeholders to maximize adoption and clinical utility. So in terms of the new CMS Core Measure, I thought it would be helpful to first put this in the perspective of the challenge of improving sepsis management. So it's good to keep in mind that sepsis is a clinical syndrome. It's not a pathologic entity necessarily. It's not as simple as this is adenocarcinoma, this is Addison's disease. It's a syndrome. It's the unregulated immune response to a life-threatening infection. It's incredibly challenging to even define sepsis, right, let alone diagnosis. We do have the third international consensus definitions, which are referenced there, which I would definitely direct you to. The way I like to think about it is, well, the way I like to think about most things is going to be in Venn diagrams, right? So If we think about starting with a patient who has 2 or more symptoms of SIRS, or systemic inflammatory response syndrome, it could be elevated heart rate, elevated white cell count. And then if you have a confirmed or suspected infection, and this word suspected is important because we know from studies that a large number of infections are never diagnosed by the laboratory. About 40% of patients with bacteremia never have a confirmed organism on microbiologic evaluation, although certainly with changing technologies in the microbiology lab, that number is reducing. But as you can imagine, that starts to make having a gold standard for sepsis incredibly challenging. Now, patients with sepsis can then progress into severe sepsis, where you have low systolic blood pressure or symptoms of end organ damage. And then finally, those with severe sepsis can move into septic shock if they have persistent signs of severe sepsis. So if we think about sepsis as a continuum, starting with sepsis and ending at multiple organ dysfunction syndrome, ultimately death of the patient, the farther along our patients are on this continuum, the higher the mortality. You can see 27% for sepsis versus 54% for septic shock. So what we'd like to know certainly is where the patient is along this continuum so we can give the appropriate level of intervention, and we can detect those who are more likely to progress. And the sooner we can do that, the better with sepsis. And this is an important point. Time is key with sepsis. So this is from a 2011 critical care paper, which looked at the running average of survival on the y-axis versus delays in the administration of effective antibiotics after the onset of septic shock. And what they found was that every hour antibiotics are delayed in sepsis increases the mortality approximately 8%. Right? And so some of you might be thinking, well, the answer is obvious, right? Patient comes in the door and we give everybody broad-spectrum antibiotics. And you might be thinking that if you've been living on a rock and haven't necessarily heard that the problem of antimicrobial resistance is becoming increasingly prevalent. You can see the Science News report talking about the slow catastrophe as the golden age of antibiotics come to an end. So for this reason, a lot of our medical centers have put in place antibiotic stewardship committee. So now our second poll question, do you sit on your organization's antibiotic stewardship committee? Yes, no, or your hospital doesn't have it. And once again, if you're unsure if your hospital has it, you can click our hospital does not have an antibiotic stewardship committee. Right? And so there's a lot of things that we need to start to consider when we're confronted with a patient who might be septic, right? This is going to be reducing unnecessary prescribing of antibiotics for those who don't have sepsis and making sure we get it quickly to those who do have it. So looking at the poll, this is interesting. To me, again, the bulk of folks do not sit on the antibiotic stewardship committee. So I think you'll find as we go on that procalcitonin has a lot of utility, which folks on these programs might be interested in, and I would suggest finding them in your organization because they can really be helpful allies as you start to think about implementing this. So in the effort to improve care for sepsis, CMS has released a new core measure. So what are core measures? So core measures are evidence-based standards of care which have been shown to improve patient outcomes. All hospitals are required to report data on their compliance with these standards of care. So the way they're reported, we're to have a denominator, which is all of the patients who were eligible to receive those standards of care, and the numerator is going to be the number of patients who actually receive the care. Many of these measures are what they call all or nothing. So if there's 9 standards of care and you administered 8, that still counts as a 0. These core measures are enforced through financial penalties. The financial penalties apply whether you fail to report or fail to meet the published core measure. And the penalties tend to be a percentage of reimbursement. As many of us in the lab know, a small percentage on very big numbers is a substantial amount. The sepsis core measures, which we'll talk about next, were introduced in 2015 for data gathering, but the penalties will be applying in fiscal year 2017. So what are these core measures? So the severe sepsis core measure, which is an all-or-nothing measure, defines 2 time points at which hospitals must meet certain criteria. So within 3 hours of patient recognition, lactate needs to be measured, blood cultures need to be obtained twice prior to the start of antibiotics, and then IV antibiotics need to be started. Within 6 hours of patient recognition, so 3 hours later, a repeat lactate must be done if the initial lactate was greater than 2. I'll mention there's still a lot of debate and discussion about these core measures. There's really no great criteria for how time zero is defined. You can imagine if you have a questionable time zero, it's hard to know when something was done 3 hours from it. And that same criticism applies with the septic shock measure, where time zero, once again, is going to be challenging to define. With this septic shock, we have those same 2 time points where hospitals must meet certain criteria. So within 3 hours of recognizing septic shock, you need to do everything that was in the severe sepsis bundle, as well as fluid resuscitation if the patient is hypotensive. And then within 6 hours, just like the last bundle, the lactate must be repeated if the initial was greater than 2. You have to start vasopressors for unresponsive hypotension and check volume status and perform tissue perfusion assessment if the lactate is greater than 4 or there's persistent hypotension. Right. So what can labs do in terms of addressing sepsis, right, beyond these core measures? And particularly, what is the role of procalcitonin, and could it serve as a good biomarker for sepsis? Right, so let's go back to our illustration of what makes something a good biomarker, right? You'll find I like to repeat things a lot, so my apologies for those paying attention, but I tend to have a short attention span, so I find bringing slides up over and over again can be helpful. Right? These are the questions we need to ask when we're thinking about whether or not procalcitonin is a useful biomarker for sepsis. Let's start with biological basis. So procalcitonin, it's a 116 amino acid precursor to calcitonin. It's produced by parenchymal cells in response to microbial toxins or host immune responses. So you can see a depiction of the protein on the left, and what I'm showing on the right is a graph of procalcitonin levels in response to different host immune responses, such as IL-beta, which induces a robust response, right? So that's good, because we know we have a good biological validity for this biomarker, selectively expressed in response to bacterial infections, as well as host immune responses, which we know make up the clinical syndrome of sepsis. So what about analytic validation? Can we actually measure this accurately? What I'll be showing here is some data using the recently released Roche procalcitonin assay. We obviously want to be measuring this in patient samples, so serum or plasma. So we have our big 3 interferences we want to be concerned with. I hope any of my residents listening could list these without any problems. Right? This is going to be icterus hemolysis, lipemia. Those are all not going to affect the assay. And then biotin is also looked at because the assay uses a biotin streptavidin approach. And biotin also does not cause any problems. And that's helpful for anybody who's read CAP Today and is aware of the growing biotin fashion fad, which is causing all of these folks to use massive amounts of biotin in the hopes of getting fairer skin or nicer hair, or I'm not sure what it does other than interfere with some of our lab results and waste their money. But nice, we know the biotin doesn't interfere. Furthermore, when we're looking at the potential interference of commonly used pharmaceuticals in this patient population, no interference with the assay was found, and our lower limits of measurement with the limit of detection and the limit of quantitation are excellent. So having a good limit of quantitation is certainly great, but with procalcitonin, we want to be able to sometimes monitor patients over time. So as important as the limit of quantitation is going to be the precision of our assays, right? So what is the CV? I'm showing here some performance data from multiple Roche platforms, and you can see we're looking at concentrations which span the range of our AMR from down near the lower end, 0.079, to up around 88 nanograms per mil. And in all cases, except for the lowest levels tested, we have CVs below 5, and even at the lowest level tested, we have CVs well below 10. So this is excellent precision and reproducibility. So we have an assay which can quantify procalcitonin in samples of interest at the necessary levels, right? So we have 2 down, which I will point out that for many biomarkers, that's not always the case, right? I'm thinking about some of the interleukins in particular, their poor analytic validation, but we'll focus on procalcitonin. So 2 down. What about the clinical validation? So what studies have been done to look at the sensitivity and specificity in the intended patient population? I think it's good to step back for a minute and remember the challenge we're asking of a biomarker for sepsis, right? This is challenging to define, let alone diagnose. It's a clinical syndrome. We have confirmed or suspected infection, questionable gold standard for the diagnosis of sepsis. This is not a straightforward question. Still, I think you'll see that procalcitonin has done quite well if we look at some of the published data. So if we look, for instance, at the receiver operator characteristic curve for serum biomarkers, in this case I'm looking at procalcitonin, CRP, interleukin-6, and lactate, and we look at the performance. This is the sensitivity versus specificity in the rock plot. You can see PCT has excellent diagnostic performance. I think one of the better studies is a recent meta-analysis which was done, which pooled a large number of studies which have been done, both prospective and retrospective, and it found an overall area under the curve of 0.85. So if this was a resident lecture, this is where I would ask my residents to tell me what the AUC means. Since it's not a resident lecture, this is me monologuing here for a while, I will just mention that it is going to be integration of the area under the rock plot shown to the left. An AUC of 0.5 is going to be a terrible diagnostic test, and an AUC of 1 is going to be excellent. Now, beyond looking at sensitivity and specificity of procalcitonin for sepsis, remember we also want to remember that sepsis is a continuum, and so it can be helpful to know where on this continuum patients are and whether or not they're progressing along the continuum. So, can procalcitonin do that for us? Can it help us predict those patients who are most likely to be at higher risk of mortality so that we can intervene with more aggressive interventions in the ICU? So looking at some of that data, and the table shown here on the right is actually taken out of the package insert. What we're looking at here now is the delta or change in procalcitonin from the first day or day 0 of ICU admission minus the procalcitonin level on day 4, all of which divided by that initial procalcitonin level. And so what we found was that in patients diagnosed with severe sepsis or septic shock, if we actually had the procalcitonin change by greater than 80%, then we would consider the test negative, and those patients had a significant lower mortality risk. Whereas if the delta procalcitonin was less than or equal to 80, then the test was positive, and those patients were at a higher risk for mortality. So that's great. So now we know that procalcitonin has shown acceptable sensitivity and specificity for sepsis It can help us start to identify those patients at a greater risk for mortality. So what about the final one, clinical utility, which is, does this provide information that improves patient outcome or reduces the cost of patient care? And so this is our next teaching point. The other way I like to think about this is, what do we as laboratorians need to do in terms of offering this test for it to be impactful? And towards that end, I wanted to bring us back to that troponin scenario I presented, right? Troponin is and can be a good biomarker, but in this scenario, I would argue, and I don't think anybody would contest me on this, that it's not a clinically useful biomarker because of that 11-hour turnaround time. This is what I would describe as a good biomarker gone bad. It has good performance, but the way it's utilized in the lab isn't actually helping our patients. So what can we do about that? I think most of you have done exactly what we've done, right? Which is address that long turnaround time. So what we do in our hospital, let's say that same patient comes in Friday night, 10 p.m., within 20 minutes, they have their troponin ordered. Within 20 minutes, it's spun and loaded onto our instrument stat so that within about 20 minutes, we can have the troponin result in the patient's medical record. So at my institution, we are a stroke center for excellence, and part of that means us closely monitoring our door to lab result time, and we've managed to achieve greater than 90% of our troponin results coming from those stroke panels in under 60 minutes. How are we able to do this? Well, so the first is we have a dedicated random access analyzer. So this is an instrument which does other analyses, which is helpful because that way I can justify having the technologist actually working there and knowing how to use it. We certainly don't batch our troponins. We make sure that the testing is offered 24/7. And then this instrument allows us to perform some of these other relevant tests such as troponin, our HCGs, as well as IOPTH. It's all done on a single instrument, so I can justify the resources to actually handle those and run them stat right away. Once again, we're not going to be talking about troponin, right? Why am I thinking so much about troponin when really, if I'm worried about lab tests for folks coming into my emergency department, sepsis is far and away a bigger cause of concern. So what am I doing to report one of these useful biomarkers of sepsis, procalcitonin? So unfortunately, our current testing really is not providing any clinical value to our patient or our health system. But I don't think I'm alone on this. So you can see we have another poll. How often is procalcitonin testing offered in your hospital? So do you offer it 24/7? Is it one or more times per day? Less than once a day? Or we do not currently perform procalcitonin testing in our lab? So I can tell you if I were to answer this, I would pick option 2, one or more times per day. So we do offer it 7 days a week, but it's batch run at 9 a.m., 11 a.m., and 2 p.m. So I'll be interested to know if folks here on this webinar just want to know how to improve procalcitonin testing or actually thinking about bringing it in. So let's see what folks said. So it looks like a little over half of you do not currently perform procalcitonin testing in your lab, although I have to say I am impressed that almost a third offer it 24/7, which I would argue is really the way you have to offer procalcitonin testing for it to be useful. So the situation that we have currently at my institution, when we receive the sample, it's going to sit and be batched at those 3 defined time points. What this means is we have poor availability and incredibly long turnaround times. So our median turnaround time is 6 hours. And if you look at the graph on the right, and I should mention this graph was prepared by one of our pathology residents, Michael Nowak, who has an interest in this. You can see that the turnaround time in hours extends well past that 10-hour mark. we have a decent number of results with turnaround times in the 10 to 15 hour range, or longer based on what might happen with the instrument. So why is this? So currently our procalcitonin testing is performed on what I refer to as an orphan instrument. So this is our Vitus. It's an instrument which doesn't do much, if any, necessary testing besides that single analyte. And that means all of my SOPs, all of my maintenance, all of my employee proficiency testing, all of the LIS interface, the CAP checklists associated with these instruments are all done for a single assay. Beyond that, I can't really justify the resources to have someone 24/7 running that as samples come in, and that's why we have been batching these. So what do we have to do to make this a clinically useful biomarker? So I think we need to do exactly what most hospitals have done for their cardiac markers. Right? We need to have this available on a dedicated random access analyzer so we can offer testing 24/7 with rapid turnaround time. Right? That way, when the patient comes in with concern for sepsis, any hour of the day into the ED, receive the sample, we spin it, load it stat, and we get a result which can help the clinician direct management of that patient. In order to do that, you really need a single instrument which can do more than one test. Right? In my ideal world, I'm already dedicating the time and resources to stat loading troponins on a single instrument, as well as stat loading my HCGs. If I could just add procalcitonin to that list, my life would become substantially easier. The operational burdens of the lab would be diminished because I could be done with that orphan instrument, and I would be able to improve the service we're offering because I could have a door-to-result for procalcitonin in under 60 minutes. Ideally, my techs tell me they'd also like to see us reduce that incubation time of the IOPTH. While 17 minutes seems relatively fast, I'm told when you have an irate surgeon calling you every 2 minutes for a result, that faster is always better. So I guess the question, though, is a door-to-result of 60 minutes something that you just sort of picked at random, or is this something which I think has some basis? So there was some work done by Good Hope Hospital over in the UK, and they instituted what they term the Sepsis 6. So this is a bundle of 6 standards, so high flow oxygen, blood cultures, IV antibiotics. You can see many of them made their way into the CMS Sepsis Core bundle, which were all supposed to be delivered within 1 hour. And when they looked at their data, they found that those patients receiving that bundle within 1 hour had half the mortality of those not receiving the bundle within 1 hour. And this is why I really feel that the laboratory markers for sepsis demand that random access rapid turnaround time in 1 hour or less, if possible, to have some real clinical value. Still, I know many of us are used to having these analytes that we'd like to bring in-house, and there's always this question with the stakeholders, right? We're going to be potentially asking for additional resources or expanding our test menu, which sometimes requires resources as well. So how do we position this so that we can maximize adoption and the clinical utility? Well, I want to remind you about the cost of sepsis, right? Median cost per patient of $22,000, leading healthcare expenditure by condition. And what I'll say here is this $22,000, that's not the lab testing, that's treatment. This is where I always like to mention to folks that detecting sepsis, identifying sepsis early is not expensive. Treating sepsis is incredibly expensive. And the longer it takes you to treat, the longer that patient is going to need to be treated and the higher the mortality they're going to suffer. Right? And this has been borne out in the literature. If we look at some findings, so this is one example out of the literature. I'll have the references at the end, where they instituted an early recognition and treatment of sepsis program. So I'll point out that this is an early recognition program. So this is having defined signs such as vital signs, heart rate, blood pressure, etc. and not entirely leveraging some of the biomarkers which are out there. You can see in the before group, they had a median cost per patient of just about $22,000 without the recognition program, although you'll notice the box and whisker plots have substantial variation with cost of care sending up over $50,000 easily for some of the patients. After instituting the early recognition program, that median cost per patient dropped down to $16,000, and that's a savings of just under $6,000 per patient with early recognition. So $6,000 can save a substantial amount of money to your hospital when it's per patient, and you can get a lot of lab testing done in there. I'll also mention that the length of stay and overall mortality actually dropped. So that's the graph on the right where you can see the early recognition program consistent with what we know. Early recognition and treatment of sepsis improves outcome and reduces hospital stay. This is something which was also seen by Good Hope Hospital, who had introduced their Sepsis 6 bundle, right, where they're giving defined treatment all within 1 hour. An interesting thing happened with their project, actually. They found that they had relatively poor compliance, and this is something which is prevalent throughout the literature, actually, that you have a lot of places who institute sepsis recognition programs and have poor compliance. So getting folks to actually recognize the syndromes and coordinate the care among the team can be incredibly challenging. So at Good Hope Hospital, this sort of inadvertently created a control group and a non-control group. So that group of patients not receiving the 1 hour bundle who had an almost 40% mortality rate are actually patients on those same floors at the same time they instituted the sepsis bundle, just ones where the sepsis bundle was not actually received within the 1 hour. And so that created that nice control group where they can really see the impact of early recognition treatment for those receiving the bundle. The final cost analysis from this was 2 fewer critical care bed days and 3.4 fewer hospital bed days, which led to an estimated savings of about £5,000 per patient. I have no idea how much that would be in today's dollars. But I will also mention that reduction in ICU bed days is something which has consistently been observed. And when I think about the amount of lab testing we do on our patients in the ICU, and I don't think I'm alone on this, just diminishing the amount of time patients spend in the ICU would actually probably reduce the amount of testing I do in my lab, even if it means bringing in an additional assay to do it. So where does this leave us? What is the lab's role in sepsis? So this is how I like to think about it. Right? We have our clinician, whether they're the emergency department clinician, the ICU clinician, and they're confronted with a patient who may or may not have sepsis, this clinical syndrome which is incredibly challenging to diagnose. This clinician knows the literature. They know the problem with overprescribing unnecessary antibiotics. They know the long-term costs, the increased mortality, the increased expense just in the antibiotics. But they also know the literature in terms of how much mortality increases every hour that they delay. And so they're sort of faced with this difficult choice of deciding what to do with the patient. And I really feel like the lab's job is to make sure that that clinician has all of the information we can possibly give them in a time frame which allows them to integrate that information and make a more informed decision. And this is something where I don't think that one lab test is ever going to be the definitive marker of sepsis. It's always going to be a data point which fits into the overall clinical scenario. Okay, so this clinician might be confronted with a patient who they feel strongly needs antibiotics, and even in the face of a low procalcitonin, possibly because recent septic onset and the procalcitonin hasn't had a chance to increase yet, they're still going to give antibiotics. Our job is not to give this result which they must follow. is to give more information so that more often than not, as they integrate that into their decision-making process, they're making the right decision. And so with that, I'll include the works cited, and I would be happy to take any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Hayden, for that informative presentation. Before we get started on the question and answer session, I would like to remind our audience how to submit questions. You can submit questions by typing them in the Q&A box, which can be found by clicking on the green Q&A button at the lower left of the presentation window. We'll try to answer as many questions as we can. Okay, our first question is, Dr. Hayden, as you stated during your presentation, the days of orphan instruments are behind the efficiency and quality-focused labs of today and tomorrow. Given that, what other high medical value biomarkers do you look to adopt on Roche's cobas E411 that will make a significant impact in patient care?
Yeah, so this is something I've thought about a good bit, and the easy answer might be as many as I can get on there. But the more honest answer is I think that there are certain ones where we know that patients are actively awaiting care based on the result of that assay, and those are ideal ones to put on that E411 platform. So the immediate ones that come to mind are certainly going to be procalcitonin. It's definitely going to be intraoperative parathyroid hormone. So for those not familiar with it, IOPTH is going to be a marker of cancer in the parathyroid, and they're going to do a parathyroidectomy where they remove what they think is all of the tumor, and then they look for levels of the IOPTH to drop consistent with the successful surgery. So when we get those samples, there's a patient somewhere on a table lying opened with an entire surgical team waiting for those results to decide if they're done with the surgery or they need to continue. So that is exactly the sort of assay I want to have on that platform. And then in addition, absolutely our cardiac markers.
Okay, next question. What role will the lab play in educating clinicians on PCT? What results mean, how to use it, etc.? And who will be serving in that capacity? Will you be putting together a committee to share in this responsibility?
Yeah, so I definitely think that speaking with the clinicians is always an interesting situation where you can have some really great interactions, and other times it's not as great. The best advice I've gotten, which we try to follow and will try to follow, is to find our clinician advocates, our champions, those folks on our sepsis committee, on the antimicrobial stewardship committee. So this is going to be hospital epidemiology, some of the ID specialists who are aware of the literature and are aware of how helpful this testing has proven to be in published studies, and working with them to have them champion this, I think, is one of the most important things that labs can do. And then beyond that, making sure that you're offering a service which meets the needs. You don't want to be in a position of proposing to offer this testing, and yet you have, like we do, 11-hour turnaround time, and that's not going to be terribly helpful. So definitely make sure that your own internal processes meet the clinical needs, and then find your clinical champion, possibly on those sepsis committees or antimicrobial stewardship committees are a great place to start.
Next question. Do we understand why a hormone for calcium homeostasis is released in response to infection?
That's a very good question, yes. So procalcitonin is the prohormone of calcitonin, but it has nothing to do with the calcium regulation. And it's actually secreted by different cells, although I have seen some case reports of elevated PCTs with different malignancies. But to answer the question, I'm not sure why procalcitonin is secreted in response.
Next question. I'm a microbiologist and I am not familiar with IOPTH. What is it?
Yeah, so sorry, I realized I was falling into the trap of using abbreviations which aren't always commonplace. So IOPTH, as I'd mentioned, is intraoperative parathyroid hormone. So this is going to be used as a marker of malignancy to decide if tumor removal is successful or if they need to continue.
Does PCT replace lactate?
Yeah, that's another good one. So lactate has definitely made its way into the CMS Core Measures, and lactate in general is a very good marker of end organ damage. So I certainly don't see it replacing lactate because it would still be important to know if your patient has reached that level, but I also don't see it excluding the use of procalcitonin. So procalcitonin is going to be an earlier marker of septic damage, whereas I think lactate is more a sign that damage has already been done. So no, I don't see it replacing. I also think, as I tried to mention in the last slide, sepsis is such a challenging diagnosis that there's no one test which is going to be excellent for it and replace all the others. It really is making sure we get the best data possible, which might include multiple markers.
Next question. Does every patient get PCT, or do you have exclusion criteria?
So we currently do not have any particular exclusion criteria other than clinical presentation. And so I would not recommend every patient get procalcitonin. You know, I think pretest probability is something we always need to keep in mind when we're doing testing. But if there is a suspicion for potential sepsis, then I do think that procalcitonin should definitely be ordered. There are cases where procalcitonin can be complicated by other ongoing factors. So our Department of Surgery, for instance, is incredibly interested in markers of infections and sepsis. They're very interested in procalcitonin, and while it can have some utility there, it's worth keeping in mind that major trauma, including large surgery, can actually temporarily elevate procalcitonin, and then procalcitonin can be elevated in neonates just at early stages of life. So you certainly need to be considerate of the patients it's being tested on and whether there might be confounders which would reduce its diagnostic accuracy.
Dr. Hayden, does procalcitonin predict fungal sepsis?
Yeah, so there is some very interesting work which I've recently seen, and let me say the literature on procalcitonin is tremendous, so my apologies for those who were hoping to hear many of its other uses. You'll note I didn't even talk about the de-escalation of antimicrobial therapy, and anybody who just read the recent Lancet article for the SAPS trial was probably hoping to hear that. Another area is going to be I'm sorry, I just blanked on the question. Would you repeat the question again?
Yes, one moment. I asked, does procalcitonin predict fungal sepsis?
Yes, I'm sorry, I got myself on a tangent. You can see what my residents have to deal with me. Anyways, there was some recent literature looking at potential for procalcitonin to discriminate between gram-positive, gram-negative, as well as fungal infections. So fungal infections, it will rise up in response to the fungal infections, and there's been very limited data to suggest that perhaps the magnitude of increase might actually be somewhat informative of the nature of the infection, but that absolutely remains to be seen whether that's going to be borne out by larger studies and trials. But answer to the question is yes, you will get a rise in procalcitonin.
Okay, what advantage does PCT have over lactate?
What advantage does PCT have over lactate? Yeah, so lactate is going to be a good indicator of end organ damage. There's other markers for mortality, right? So sequential sepsis-related organ failure, SOFA score, SOFA, for instance, which is going to look at creatinine, bilirubin, all of these things, which just like lactate, are markers of end organ failure. I do think we want to be asking ourselves, do we really want to use markers of organ damage to know when we need to be concerned, right? You want to wait for your car to break down before you know that you should have maybe changed the oil or something like that. So that's really how I see procalcitonin contributing as an earlier marker. You don't necessarily have to wait for the end organ damage, which is caused by that uncontrolled immune response. You can hopefully start to earlier detect indications of the immune response through elevated levels of procalcitonin.
Now, Dr. Hayden, are you planning on moving this to the Roche analyzers to improve TAT?
I would say it is twofold. The first is definitely to improve the turnaround time. The second really is going to be the operational savings. We're in the midst of getting ready for our CAP inspection window, and so I'm thinking carefully about all of our potential vulnerabilities for citations. And it's amazing if you just go through the CAP checklist, how many items are there for each instrument you have in the lab. And so a chance to do platform consolidation, to have a single analyzer which can do some of these analytes like the IOPTH, the troponin, procalcitonin, etc., saves us a substantial amount of work. And then I only have to train folks on a single instrument. I only have to have a single interface. So it is the turnaround time improvement, but I suspect we're going to realize some very helpful operational savings.
In the ROC curves you showed for better SN and SP with PCT over lactate other, what time points for PCT measurement were used to diagnose sepsis?
That's a good question. I don't recall the time points used. So PCT is going to rise up relatively quickly, within 6 hours, they say. So it would be early time point. This would not be days later, and I would have to look. My suspicion is most of the trials I've looked at, which have been prospective, have done it at what we would call time zero, so time suspicion of sepsis. But there have certainly been some retrospective looks which have used whatever time it was ordered. So I'm sorry, I'm not sure.
Dr. Hayden, are there different manufacturers that offer PCT testing?
Oh yes, absolutely. Certainly, there are other manufacturers who offer. There are not as many, and for a while there was really only one for a very long time. But there certainly are others. We currently use the Vitis instrument, which is procalcitonin, and have been using that for quite a while in our batched format. So there are certainly other options. And I think each lab needs to evaluate what works best for them. We're a relatively high volume lab, so we're looking at over 10 million chemistry tests, have a large amount of outreach business, but also our relatively large hospital business. And so, we have unique challenges and advantages. And so this is the platform that works best for us. we think, moving to the Roche solution, but there are other options out there.
Many ER docs are taught that lactate is the best indicator of sepsis and that PCT is not ready for prime time due to the lack of studies as of 2014. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, since I'm being webinar cast and recorded, I'm going to try to be a little cautious here, but inevitably, I guess I've said enough stupid things, I might as well just go for it. I find this interesting situation occurs when I'm speaking with some clinicians about procalcitonin, and I would say that those who feel they least need it are the ones who most need it. Perhaps it's just some sort of Dunning-Kruger effect where, not recognizing how complicated and challenging sepsis is means that you think you're always right. But the reality is that absolutely there's a perception out there that folks are doing a very good job with sepsis, and in some cases that absolutely is the case. And as I said, I'd never recommend somebody base treatment solely off of a lab test. Clinical evaluation of the patient is still going to be paramount. But I also think that there is a bit of hubris involved, that folks think they already have all the biomarkers, they already have all the information they need, they're making the best possible decisions. And that is especially apparent when I talk with many of the more informed clinicians, such as infectious disease specialists, hospital epidemiologists, those who are aware of the challenge of sepsis and the performance of actually being able to recognize it by experienced clinicians. So that's where I think finding those more informed clinicians and having them help you convey the message is really important.
Dr. Hayden, the next question is 3 parts. Would you make the test only available to certain hospital locations' clinicians? Would you put a limit in how many PCT can be requested in 24 hours? And when you implement the test, how do you measure that it is being used effectively and as intended?
Yeah, so these are all 3 great questions. And if you don't mind, I'm going to get asked just to repeat one at a time. But let me say right off, this is really asking about the lab utilization culture in your hospital, which is going to vary tremendously across the U.S. Not to mention, if you go across the world, I was speaking with somebody recently who was telling me about some of the situations in some of the European countries where the labs have the ability to have more say over what's ordered and what's not. So I'll answer each individual one, but it definitely needs to be put in the context of your institution's lab utilization culture. So I think the first one was, would we allow just anybody to order it? Is that correct?
Would you make the test only available to certain hospital locations' clinicians?
So in my hospital, we would not. We would have that available to be ordered at clinician discretion. However, we do sometimes monitor, and so we'll sometimes do targeted interventions to inform folks if we see, actually, you're ordering a lot of procalcitonin, and it's probably not right for your patient population, but it would be available for anybody. And then I think there was a question, too, about the frequency that we would define.
Of limiting, would you limit how many PCT could be requested in a 24-hour period?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I've been working with our hospital epidemiology and members of the sepsis committee to define, how often should it be ordered to give some of these guidelines. One could imagine setting up an order set, and this is certainly something I've thought about, where the clinician places a single procalcitonin order, and let's say the time 0 and day 4 order are sort of already in the system. So we will absolutely be looking at ways to guide people towards appropriate ordering, but I won't necessarily put initial hard stops should they choose to order every 2 hours. And yes, it pains me to say that, but that's not my institution's culture, partially because we've had very good success doing sort of educational initiatives and not doing it. If you're at a place, I think Kaiser does a great job of sort of determining who can order what and when, then that's absolutely something you could think about.
In the last part of that question, when you implement the test, how do you measure that it is being used effectively and as intended?
Yeah. So in terms of looking at how it's being used and whether it's being used as it's intended, so those would be a lot of internal quality improvement, quality assurance projects. So you saw Dr. Michael Nowak did the work looking at the turnaround time for procalcitonin. Right? We've had other residents who have been interested in looking at how tests are being used and its utility, and a lot of times it comes from the clinical services too. They have residents and fellows who take an interest in that, and so that's how we would try to do that, is to partner with folks and look at those QI projects, certainly in consultation with our IRB, because sometimes that blurs the line between research and pure quality improvement.
Dr. Hayden, based on your presentation, CMS currently does not require PCT as part of its process to diagnose sepsis. When do you foresee CMS adopting this PCT testing into their recommendations? And why hasn't it been recommended up to this point?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't know where it might go, and honestly, from conversations I've had, I'm not sure where the sepsis bundles are going to go. They were highly debated in terms of, are these the best standards? I think there's good universal consensus that we need to implement better standard of care for sepsis at some places, and we need to start encouraging those. But what are those standards? And so I do think that that's one of the reasons that the Sepsis Core bundles have some of those, I would call them more traditional, the lactates and that. It's absolutely part of it. When you're introducing a bundle which is controversial, you try to leave as many controversial things as possible out of it. And in addition, there's also the issue of you don't want to implement a standard of care that every hospital can't meet, right? So they do consider the availability of testing. And we saw in the poll that not everybody is doing procalcitonin, and so to just require it as part of a core measure is going to be challenging. So I think increasing adoption of procalcitonin and having it more widely available could potentially impact that. But more importantly, I think there's going to be a lot of discussion and review of what these core measures do in terms of improving patient care, and whether we need to rethink what all is included, rethink some of the interventions, rethink the time points, hopefully define time zero. It's definitely going to be an evolving process.
I believe we have time for a few more questions. Which is the best analytic method to test PCT?
Which is the best analytic method to detect PCT? So let me give the caveat that one of my special side interests is mass spectrometry. And so whenever asked what's the best analytic method, I always have that fallback, always mass spectrometry. But I don't see us implementing peptide-based proteomics, large scale, with under 1 hour turnaround time. So no, it really is going to depend on what the requirements for use are. You need to be able to detect down to the low levels. You need to have good precision on your assays, because as you can imagine, a lot of folks are using this to predict 28-day mortality risk, in which case they're looking at the difference between two levels. So the precision is essential. Lack of interferences going to be important, and then beyond that, whatever platform allows you to get out the results in a clinically usable time frame. Yeah, I hope I did an adequate job not answering that question, but talking for a while.
Dr. Hayden, how frequently would you recommend checking a patient's procalcitonin level?
Yeah, so it's going to depend. I think that there are different clinical scenarios, and I think that something that labs can start to do actively is to inform how this testing could and should be used. So I'll just give one scenario. You have procalcitonin down around 0.2, 0.3 in a patient with a very high clinical suspicion of sepsis. I don't think it's unreasonable to retest that level in 6 hours to see if maybe you just caught them early and to spike it up. At the same time, if you have a patient with a procalcitonin greater than 10, I'm not sure if there's much utility in retesting that 6 hours later. So I think that labs need to think carefully about the algorithm. So ours, which we're envisioning, is an elevated procalcitonin does not require a follow-up, not right away, not within that day. And certainly you would want to retest again within that day 4 time frame, but then also we're starting to look at how can we use this for antimicrobial stewardship, and so that's going to define those time points. At what point can we check those patients with elevated procalcitonins to make decisions on discontinuing antibiotics. So that'll primarily be based on that SAPS trial, which came out, which we'll be speaking with hospital epidemiology about.
We've had so many great questions coming in, and we have time for one last question. Dr. Hayden, what is the added value of PCT compared to a cheap CRP result?
Yeah, that's actually, it's interesting that the lactate came up because the CRP is the one that I get more often than anything. It's hard to deny the advantages of CRP. They're on our automated platforms. They're dirt cheap. We can run them all the time. And they certainly are a nonspecific marker of inflammation. So, in the right patient, you're going to see some value there. I think the real utility of procalcitonin is its improved specificity for sepsis, so that you have a lot more confidence that that marker you're following is a better indicator of what's going on with your patient from a septic standpoint. So, nonspecific inflammatory processes are far less likely to elevate procalcitonin than they are CRP, and that's pretty well played out in the literature as well. That these patients with elevated procalcitonins typically also have elevated CRPs, but a lot of patients with low normal procalcitonins also have elevated CRPs. And then the kinetics of CRP is also going to be different. So last I was reading over the CRP lags behind procalcitonin. So one could argue that if you're actually catching the patient early enough, PCT might be elevated while the CRP hasn't risen up yet. I'm not sure how often that is in the real world standpoint, but I really think its specificity is the big point.
I would like to once again thank Dr. Joshua Hayden for his presentation. Dr. Hayden, do you have any final comments for us?
I have to say that from my standpoint, I'm very excited for this assay coming out on this particular platform. I remember when I heard about it, my eyes sort of lit up. I think what you have is this true random access analyzer where clearly effort has been made to shorten incubation time so you can get rapid turnaround times. We were already interested in something like the E411 for our IOPTH because, frankly, it's the perfect analyzer for these sort of stat assays that you need to offer. And while we were already thinking about it, Roche kind of came and gave us this gift of validating and getting FDA clearance for procalcitonin. And so they sort of have this ideal platform for this biomarker. And we're pretty excited to see how that impacts our hospital and the care we're able to give our patients.
Dr. Hayden, thank you for your time today. I would also like to thank lab leaders for making today's webcast possible. A dedicated discussion guide will be available with on-demand access to this webcast on the webinars page of lableaders.com within the coming weeks. You will also find many more webinars on demand there, as well as information on the next installment of the Lab Leaders webinar series, Unveiling the Future of Laboratory Medicine, a series of high-impact talks from lab leaders on the leading edge. During this presentation, Dr. Katie Thoren, attending clinical chemist at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center, Dr. Mark Morzinski, Director of Pre-Analytical and Main Chemistry and Director of the Clinical Pharmacology Analytical Laboratory within the Division of Clinical Pharmacology at Johns Hopkins University, and Dr. Joe L. Khoury, Co-Director of Clinical Chemistry and Clinical Chemistry Fellowship Program at the Yale New Haven Health, will be teaming up to discuss the future of immunology, precision medicine, and big data in a series of 3 high-impact presentations. Please ensure you're registered on lableaders.com for full access. Today's webcast will also be available for on-demand viewing through April 5th, 2017 on LabRoots. You will receive an email from LabRoots alerting you when this webcast will be available for replay. We invite you to forward that announcement to your colleagues who may have missed today's live event. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to see you next time. Until then, goodbye.